Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your attention. I'm Catherine Clark. I'm the University Librarian here at Curtin in my second week. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm also the MC for the event today. So before we start the afternoon's program, I just wanted to mention that the lecture's being recorded and will be available on the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library website at a later date. Can I just remind you also to silence or turn off all of your mobile phones? So the program for this afternoon will commence with Curtin's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Deborah Terry, opening proceedings with an official welcome to the Curtin campus and an overview of the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library. And Professor Terry will then introduce Dr. Geoff Gallop, who will present the 2014 Anniversary Lecture, which is titled, "Is Constitutional Freedom Enough? The Battle for the Heart and Soul of a Nation." Then the vote of thanks will be provided by JCPML Historical Consultant, Professor David Black, followed by the presentation of a gift from the Vice-Chancellor to Dr. Gallop. And then there'll be an opportunity to join with all of the other guests here for refreshments in the atrium. So I'd like to now invite Professor Terry to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and welcome to Curtin. In welcoming everybody to our campus today, I pay my respects to the Indigenous members of our community by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Noongar people of Western Australia, and paying my respects to their elders past and present. It's my great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our special guest and anniversary lecturer, Dr. Geoff Gallop, Chancellor Mr. Colin Beckett, the Honorary Consul of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Mr. Arnold Stroobach, current and former Members of Parliament, Professor David Black, Historical Consultant, John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library, or the JCPML, members of the Curtin family, other distinguished guests, friends and colleagues. Since 1998, the annual JCPML Anniversary Lecture has been held to commemorate the contribution to Australia made by Prime Minister Curtin, after whom this university is so proudly named. The university embraces the values held by John Curtin, whose vision, leadership and commitment to community service formed the basis of his inspiring and exemplary leadership of the nation during World War II. John Curtin became Prime Minister on the 7th of October 1941, and just 2 months later, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he announced that Australia was at war with Japan. His strength of character was evident in his commitment and his devotion to Australia and its people during this very difficult time of conflict. He worked tirelessly to unite all Australians, to secure the nation from attack and to lay the foundations for post-war prosperity. But sadly, John Curtin died on the 5th of July 1945 in the closing weeks of the war. The university established the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library to care for the late Prime Minister's personal papers, to make them publicly accessible, and to recognise his political and his social achievements. Events such as this anniversary lecture provide an opportunity for us all to reflect on the enduring legacy of John Curtin and also to reflect on the thoughts of leaders and commentators of our time. We're very proud that so many eminent Australians have agreed to present past lectures, including JCPML patrons, the Honourable Gough Whitlam and the Honourable Paul Keating, former Prime Minister, the Honourable Malcolm Fraser, Senator John Faulkner. Other distinguished presenters include Hazel Hawke, whose papers are also held in the library, journalist Paul Kelly, Dr. Ashton Calvert, Professor Larissa Berendt, Professor of Law at UTS, and former US Ambassador Jeffrey Blake. In 2012, the world premiere of the play The Fremantle Candidate, that was written by Ingle Knight and produced by Deck Chair Theatre, was held in place of the annual lecture, but in 2013 we returned to lectures and the lecture was presented by the Honourable Robert French, Chief Justice of Australia. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Geoff Gallop, continues the long line of distinguished presenters of this anniversary lecture. He's currently the Director of the Graduate School of Government at the University of Sydney, and he was Premier of Western Australia from 2001 to 2006. Dr. Gallop was born in Geraldton. His father, Douglas, was a company secretary with liberal political leanings, but his mother, Eunice, came from a family with trade union and Labor affiliations. Dr. Gallop excelled at university and graduated with an economics degree from UWA in 1971. In 1972, he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship and studied PPE, Philosophy, Politics and Economics, at St John's College in Oxford. He was awarded a Master of Arts from Oxford in 1974 and later a Doctor of Philosophy, also from Oxford, in 1983. Although initially a member of the UWA Liberal Club, Geoff Gallop joined the Australian Labor Party in 1971, finding a more natural home for his opposition to the Vietnam War and his support for the reform of Australian society. By 1972, he was president of the UWA branch. Before entering politics, he was a temporary organiser with the Miscellaneous Workers Union. He lectured in social and political theory at both Murdoch University and UWA, and by 1983 he'd become a political radio commentator and had published a number of significant academic articles. Between 83 and 86 he served on the Fremantle City Council, and when the opportunity came up to contest the Labor seat of Victoria Park, Dr. Gallop moved his family to the electorate and successfully contested a by-election in June 1986. On the 8th of October 1996 he was elected Leader of the Opposition, and in February 2001 Dr. Gallop led the ALP to victory and was sworn in as Premier on the 16th of February. Among the many significant achievements of his government, he cites saving old growth forests, improving the well-being of Indigenous Australians, and constructing the Mandurah rail line as among the things that gave him the most satisfaction. As Curtin's John Phillimore has observed, there is much in common between Dr. Gallop and John Curtin. Both were highly respected and liked by both sides of politics. Both were steeped in knowledge of the socialist movement, but were able to bring pragmatism and realism to their time in government in order to deliver progressive outcomes. And both were strong Australian nationalists, but deeply understood and supported the needs of WA. Curtin was honoured that Dr. Gallop chose to lodge his personal papers with the JCPML in 2006, and he presented a Curtin Library public lecture at the launch of the Gallop collection on the 30th of November 2006, entitled The Case for Politics. It's my great pleasure to now invite Dr. Geoff Gallop to deliver the 2014 John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture, which is tantalisingly entitled "Is Constitutional Freedom Enough? The Battle for the Heart and Soul of a Nation." Thank you very much, Geoff.
Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my thanks to Curtin University for giving this recovering, but certainly not fully recovered political addict, the chance to reflect upon our nation and its future. It's a real privilege to do it on this particular occasion that honours the contribution John Curtin made to the country in earlier times, as an activist, as a journalist, as a Member of Parliament, as a Labor Party leader, and as Prime Minister. And each one of those parts of his life is worth study. It was a life in which the big picture was never lost, despite the day-to-day personal and political challenges he faced. Unlike too many politicians today, Curtin understood that a strong economy and a secure nation needed a good and fair society. Such a society is, as we might say, a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for national growth and security. Tackling what this means today when it comes to public policy is one way to carry forward the Curtin legacy. Tonight, however, I'm going to follow another, but not unrelated path. The topic I've chosen isn't on the top of, or indeed on the list of issues that our nation's leaders have before them today. It's summarised by a question. Is it enough that we be legally free, that the Constitution is ours and ours to change, or does freedom carry a deeper meaning that requires us to do more? It's a bit like that discussion we have in political philosophy between freedom from and freedom to. In Australia's case, such a discussion feeds off our history, initially as coloniser and colony, and then as nation-state and global citizen. It's a discussion sometimes live and sometimes dormant, but it's never completely absent. Firstly, there's the issue of the nation's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their recognition. That is on the agenda today, and hopefully heading towards legislation and a referendum. The outcome here will tell us a lot about Australia today and how we understand our history and what we expect from our society and its institutions when it comes to the question of race. Secondly, there's the question of our democracy and whether the Constitution drafted in the 1890s adequately describes our system and how we expect it to work. The last time reforms under this heading were attempted was in 1988, when 4 referendum questions dealing with parliamentary terms, fair elections, local government and rights and freedoms were rejected. Thirdly, there is the question of our ongoing links to the British Crown and whether or not they should be cut and a new republican institution created. Does true freedom require a republic as the next step in the journey, political and cultural, that has seen Australia move from 6 colonies to a self-governed and sovereign nation, or is it the case that we can't imagine, let alone create anything better than that which the Queen delivers to us today? In my talk tonight, I will outline the development of my own views on this issue, from patriotism to radicalism, and then move to attempt to distill the essence of the debate by looking into what it is that divides the true believers on each side of the fence. I will argue that this division is best explained in terms of culture, and that the real-world politics of the matter are much more complicated. Finally, I will outline what I see to be the consequences of these complications for supporters of an Australian republic. I will argue that without some form of democratic deliberation, what I call a republican means for a republican end, the realisation of a republic may prove to be a bridge too far. Importantly, there is a direct and personal connection tonight between my chosen topic and John Curtin. To explain this, I need to take you back to my hometown of Geraldton in the 1950s and 60s. It was there in my high school years that I took on board support for an Australian republic with one of our own as head of state. I remember it well, and the school essay I wrote outlining my views, for which I was only given 6.5 out of 10. I carry that grudge. On many other matters related to politics and society, I've changed my views, but not on this one. It's embedded in my political DNA. At this time, Britain still loomed large in our culture and our consciousness. We sang God Save the Queen. We celebrated Empire Day, and a good number of our vice-regal representatives were British knights. It was a powerful trifecta of influence: the Queen, the Empire, and the British ideas of hierarchy. However, it wasn't all sweet sailing for proponents of this new Britannia, and there were plenty of tensions below the surface. Firstly, there was the matter of the Second World War, the fall of Singapore, and the clashes between Curtin and Churchill over strategy and troop deployments. Both my parents, and most of their friends and relatives, had served in the Australian Defence Forces, and whatever their politics, left or right, Liberal or Labor, Curtin was their hero. It was simple. He stood tall in defence of Australian interests. Time and time again I heard this said, and that Britain couldn't be trusted, and that our national interests were at stake. Britain was Britain and Australia was Australia, with its own boundaries to protect, whether they're geographic boundaries, social or economic boundaries. Secondly, there was a recognition that Britain was turning to Europe, if only hesitantly at first, as a matter of global strategy. We'd seen how complacency on this question of Asian politics generally had caught us on the back foot in the 1940s, and there was a strong view that we weren't going to let that happen again. For security and economic reasons, our eyes were turning to the north and to Southeast Asia, and being a white Anglo-Saxon enclave celebrating empire and its institutions, rather than questioning their morality and utility, was increasingly seen as a liability. We needed a post-colonial philosophy and language for what was becoming a post-colonial world. None of these developments necessarily imply a Republican conclusion, nor was it the case that John Curtin was a Republican. However, they are the sorts of issues that provide food for thought for a young and active mind, and in my case they took me to the Australian Republic. It was a mixture of Australia first, hostility to British notions of class, and a recognition of the implications for Australia of a changing world. For my generation, ideas like this were but the first step, and the belief in an Australian Republic as one part of a wider reform of Australian society and politics came later. In my case, when a university student in the 1970s. This was an important and revolutionary time in Australian politics. Existing assumptions related to race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, economic growth and the environment, class and hierarchy, and national defence and security were all put to the test of critical reasoning, and they were found wanting. At the time, it looked as if a new generation of socialists was coming into being, as they'd done in and around the creation of the Commonwealth of Australia. In fact, the political tribe that emerged, and I recognise a few of them in here in the room with me tonight, who went on to play a significant role in Australian 20th century politics, were left liberal, and John Stuart Mill rather than Karl Marx was the major influence. It became a politics based on human rights rather than the laws of history and class struggle. Just think of the list of terms, the list of items on the reform agenda that came through in the 80s and 90s. Indigenous rights replacing terra nullius. Entrepreneurialism and the market replacing protectionism. Multiculturalism replacing white Anglo-Saxon Australia. Social equality replacing social tradition. The triple bottom line replacing the gross domestic product. And of course, on the program was an Australian Republic incorporating human rights to replace the constitutional monarchy. Connected with this radical agenda were alternative views of Australian history and the emergence of the Commonwealth. It challenged not just the historians of the right, who gloried in the triumph of British values, but also those on the left, who saw the working class on the march, but who ignored race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and the environment in their thought and practice. It was believed that the key turning points in our history, the coming of the British in 1788 and the creation of the Commonwealth in 1901, carried contradictions, both moral and political, that needed to be overcome in the interests of national renewal. And that meant a reworking of the social contract between the people and those who governed them. It was expected and hoped by that generation of radicals that a truly liberal, egalitarian and democratic republic would result. And so when I reflect upon my own views and my own case study, we see the two elements of 20th century Australian republicanism. A desire to be free and independent from British power and influence on the one hand, what we might call Australian patriotism, and a commitment to a truly liberal and democratic constitution on the other, what we might call Australian radicalism. There is, of course, no logical inconsistency between patriotism and radicalism, but in the real world of Australian republicanism there was and still are real differences at play on just how far change should go. Some saying that a so-called Crown Republic is enough, others that minimal or moderate change with an Australian as head of state would fit the bill, and others again that anything short of radical overhaul is inadequate. To this particular theme I will return later in my talk, but now I would like to take you to some important facts. The Queen is still with us, and the original Constitution is still largely intact. We've taken 44 proposals to referendum, but only 8, or 18%, have been successful. At the same time, however, there has been enormous change. A lot of it the result of campaigns initiated and carried into the community and our parliaments by the baby boomer radicals. My focus is on the theme of national freedom and independence and how they've developed. In this context, it's important to remember that the 1901 Constitution created a self-governing colony, with the British Parliament retaining full legislative power over us. For Australian patriots, this was unacceptable, and a long march commenced that culminated in the passage of the Australia Act in 1986. A number of issues were at stake. Who had authority to advise the monarch on matters Australian, including the appointment of the vice-regal representatives? Who had the final say over the interpretation of the Constitution? Who had ultimate authority over the words of that Constitution? Discussion and debate over these matters was complicated and involved a number of different forces. Firstly, there was Buckingham Palace. Secondly, the British and Australian governments, including the Australian states, and of course the Australian High Court. Much could be said about these debates, but tonight I'm only interested in the outcome and what it means. Linked to these constitutional questions are also those related to our political culture, such as the national anthem, the flag, our oaths of allegiance, and the terminology we use generally in our legal system. The long title of the Australia Act 1986 says it all. An act to bring constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the states into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. No longer is it possible for Britain to legislate with effect in Australia, or for their governments to be involved in our government, nor is it possible for there to be appeals to the Privy Council. It's not as if all of these things happened as if out of the blue, as there'd been earlier developments, both constitutional, for example, the Statute of Westminster of 1931, adopted by Australia in 1942, John Curtin playing a role in that, of course, and political, for example, over the appointment of Sir Isaac Isaacs as the first Australian-born Governor-General. However, it was the Australia Act that produced what we can safely say was a substantial settlement of the basic constitutional questions relating to national sovereignty. What this means is that the Constitution governs us all, including the Queen, who is the Queen of Australia, and can only be interpreted by Australian courts and changed by the Australian people voting in a referendum. Our flag came soon after Federation, following a competition, but it wasn't until the 1970s that Advance Australia Fair, after a competition and nationwide poll, replaced God Save the Queen, and a locally controlled and managed Australian honour system was created. In the 1990s, a new and democratised citizen pledge emerged. I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. Oaths of allegiance for our major office holders remain controversial, with God in for Tony Abbott and Kevin Rudd, but out for Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd. Sorry, God was in for Tony Abbott and Kevin Rudd, but for Julia Gillard, God was out. The Queen was in for Tony Abbott, but out for Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd. In fact, for Tony Abbott, it was a case of committing to serve both the people of Australia and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Australia. Lawyers in the room know too that debate over the use of SC, Senior Counsel, as opposed to QC, Queen's Counsel, still continues following a Queensland decision to reinstate QC in 2013. All of this activity in support of, and to some extent against, going it alone in cultural expression and terminology reminds us that the British monarch is still at the peak of our system, signing off on who are to be the governors and governors-general, even if doing so on the advice of the premiers and prime ministers. In fact, sections 58 and 59 of our Constitution give the Queen a degree of legislative power that reflects colonial beliefs from the late 19th century. A check, just to make sure British interests can be protected if necessary. Under 59, she can annul an Australian law within 12 months of its enactment, even if signed off by the Governor-General. Under 58, the Governor-General can withhold assent to a bill passed by the two houses and send it to the Queen for her consideration. Now, I'm sure we'd say that such powers are relics of the colonial past, and would never be used. However, they are, as Malcolm Turnbull points out in his Edmund Barton lecture, no doubt perfectly enforceable if utilised. Now, that being said, my argument tonight is based on the limited role the Queen is actually playing, rather than what a literal reading of the Constitution may produce. And my question is this: just what is at stake for those who support and those who oppose our continuing links with the Crown? Now, to answer this question, I'm going to follow a particular methodology. I'm going to try to get into the minds of the true believers in each camp. In other words, into the minds of those for whom the issue is a point of high principle. To do this, I'm calling on my own experience as a member and now chair of the Australian Republican movement, and on what I perceive to be the core values of those who actively support our constitutional monarchy through organisations like Australians for a Constitutional Monarchy. It's important to be objective about this, and I'll do my best, even though, of course, I have my own position. Let's go to the monarchists. For them, the Queen is more than a non-contentious link in the constitutional chain that sees governors and governors-general appointed. Rather, she is an essential part of our political system. My views on this confirmed by a debate I just chaired at the UWA Politics Club on the campus about the Republic, and certainly the constitutional monarchists in that debate said exactly what I'm saying now, so I feel that there's good evidence for what I'm saying. Firstly, she provides a living link between Australia, the history of Britain, and the politics of parliamentary government. By being there, she directs us on a journey of political education involving the emergence and development of the common law, the parliament, and democratic accountability. It may not be perfect, but it is seen by the monarchists as the best that history has produced. Secondly, she is a source of education and inspiration for our vice-regal representatives. The current Queen in particular is seen as an excellent example of how they should serve the public, support our diverse and multicultural society, and manage the powers given under the Constitution, including the reserve powers. The royal family is seen as particularly well educated in the task of representing the nation at large and well worth emulating. Thirdly, we see advocacy related to the idea of the mixed constitution, with the Queen there as a stabilising and balancing force in an otherwise unruly society. Take the hereditary monarch and her or his reserve powers out of the picture, so the argument goes, and we will be left with politicians and their power plays, with uncertainty replacing stability at the heart of politics. The fact that this role is given under our Constitution to the vice-regal representatives isn't seen to detract from the case being made. So there it is. Support for the monarchy is an essential part of our political system. It links us to British history, it's a form of education for our vice-regal representatives, and of course it's a check and a balance in the system. On the Republican side, the core arguments relate to national self-respect, equal opportunity, and democratic philosophy. The starting point is simple. It is wrong for Australia to have a citizen and resident of another nation as our head of state, no matter how limited the role may be. A republic is seen as a matter of self-respect and collective pride, the logical next step for a process that took us to the Australia Act in 1986 and can be seen at work in the changes to the way we describe and express ourselves as a people, not insignificant factors in any nation's makeup. Secondly, and in response to the fact that the Queen is actually the Queen of Australia and pledged to act as such, rather than a representative of the British people and their government, is the rejection of the hereditary principle. It is seen as offensive to the twin principles of merit and equal opportunity that apply or ought to apply for our public service and multicultural society in general. The argument here is simple. The institutions creating our head of state should be a reflection of what we believe in as a people and promoted as such. Indeed, true political education requires no less. Thirdly, and necessarily, is the argument that it is not beyond the wit and wisdom of the nation to replace our monarch with an institution and set of rules that can provide a stable framework and certainty for those involved in the day-to-day battles of politics. Indeed, the point is made that the founders of our nation did expect future generations to reflect on the continuing relevance of the Constitution they had created and had confidence that change could be managed well. If not, why the provision for referenda in our Constitution? So at the very basis of this disagreement between the two sides of true believers is a different perception of going it alone and whether it is worth the effort. The monarchists say no good can come from it, and we have a system that should be celebrated rather than changed. It's one thing, they say, to have freed ourselves from the British government, but quite another to seek to end ties to the Crown. Republicans say we can and should do better as a proud and independent people, whatever the merits of the current Queen and Constitution. They say what we've inherited is less important than what we can create as a free people. Such a debate over the relevance of the Crown is part of our political culture, creating both challenges and opportunities for those who prosecute a case for change. Firstly, there is the question of community attitudes about change itself. We resist going it alone in our defence and foreign policy for fear that our security will be threatened. We resist going it alone in our environmental positioning and policies for fear that our economy will be threatened. More generally, we could say, ideas do play a role in our politics, but coupled with a very healthy pragmatism. Has the idea been translated into an acceptable policy, we ask? Are those who have carriage of the idea to be trusted when it comes to its implementation? It's possible to believe in an idea but still vote against it because you don't like those that are given the responsibility to carry it out. It's possible to believe in something in theory but balk at efforts to put it into practice. However, in other respects, we do go it alone and with conviction. The lengthy process leading up to and including the Australia Act being a behind-the-scenes example. Read Anne Toomey's book on the emergence of the Australia Act. There's a lot of politics going on. Buckingham Palace, the states, the courts, the Queen, it's all there in that book. And there are Australians in there fighting for Australian interests all the way. Neither is it the case that patriotism and its twin brother nationalism are missing elements in Australian politics, whether our reference points are the past and or the present, and whether or not the patriots in question are on the left or right of politics. For example, a crowned republic, so-called, backed up by white Australia, a regulated labour market and a protected economy was a powerful pole of attraction within the developing labour movement. While supporters of an Australian republic may like to think patriotism is theirs by right, the circumstances of our history and the nature of the debates over what is in our national interest make it all that much more complicated. Finding a clear path through the jungle of class, party and ideology has always proved difficult for those keen on a break with the Crown. What this tells us is that the debate on this question, going it alone, yes or no, is just one of many debates we have about our society and our political system. And it can't neatly draw together under its wing other interests and other tribes. You can favour Labor but be a monarchist, just as you can be a Liberal and a Republican. You can be Green, but very happy to call upon Prince Charles to support your cause when required. You can support the monarchy, but still believe reform is necessary. Michael Kirby being a classic example. You can support the Australian Republic, but only if the changes are minimal, the late Richard McGarvey being an example. Indeed, during the 1990s, the Republican camp was divided on its politics between conservatives, moderates and radicals. And these differences may have revealed themselves over the detail of a republic, but actually were a reflection of deep differences in politics and philosophy. On the monarchist side, you can support or oppose knights and dames as part of our system of national honours. You can support or oppose the traditional oaths of allegiance that require statements of loyalty to the Queen and her successors. And you can support or oppose few or many royal visits to Australia. Just think of the different ways David Flint and Michael Kirby interpret their support for the monarchy. Or just reflect upon the different positions taken by John Howard and Tony Abbott in the way that they support their monarchism. In some ways you might say that there is an egalitarian and sort of Republican wedge within the monarchist camp, just as there is a sceptical and one might say monarchist wedge within the Republican camp. For these reasons, I think it's best to describe this war going on between the true believers of the Australian Republican movement and the Australians for Constitutional Monarchy as a culture war over whether or not we stick with the Crown. In this war, it's a little easier for the monarchists because they have a clearly defined public policy bottom line, whereas the Republicans are united only by attitude and aspiration, but not specifics over the means and ends to be chosen. What this means is that it's quite possible for the Republicans to win a culture war without winning the political battle that must follow if change is to be legislated. This is precisely what happened in Australia in the 1990s, when there was strong evidence for a majority in favour of an Australian republic, but not for the specific proposal that went to referendum in 1999. The Australian Republic too is in real competition for political space. Interesting and involving people in a campaign to create a new national institution with our own citizen as head of state comes up against lots of other unfinished business from the baby boomer revolution of the 1970s. Number one, Indigenous recognition, currently on our agenda and seen as a priority within the reform side of the Australian population at the moment. The other is a bill or Charter of Rights, which got Guernsey in the 1988 referendum, if only in a small measure, and was defeated at the referendum. We've also got campaigns on the other side, of course, by more conservative monarchists who want to toughen up, or at least defend more vigorously the monarchical element in our constitution, thus the re-emergence of knights and dames. Note as well the view that developed in the 1990s, characterised by John Howard's relaxed and comfortable reference, one of the most brilliant pieces of marketing I think we've ever seen in Australian politics, that there'd been too much change and we needed to pause and digest it all. Such an attitude works against change of any sort, whether economic, social or constitutional. So all of this reminds us that the debate over whether or not we should go it alone doesn't occur in a vacuum, but rather in the context of competing views on a wide range of social, economic, political and environmental questions. Now this leads me to ask a very awkward question, particularly for someone of a Republican persuasion. And the question is this: is it possible to get this issue back onto the parliamentary agenda? Is an Australian Republic a goal too difficult, just too complicated to digest and resolve? Last time round, in the 1990s, the project would never have gathered as much momentum as it did without the leadership of Paul Keating. He was a true believer. Republicanism was absolutely at the core of his convictions. And he understood that things don't just happen, they have to be made to happen. And might I say, just as Gough Whitlam inspired the idealists of the 1960s to join or support Labor, Keating inspired Republicans to join or support the Australian Republican movement. Without Keating, the Republic would have remained what it's always been, a good idea, but no more than that. Of course, he was defeated, and John Howard came to power in 1996, and he let the Republican case run its course, but under terms and conditions that limited its chances for success. No conspiracy here, just politics, as one should expect it to be so, John Howard being John Howard with John Howard's convictions. However, rather than reconsider strategy in the light of this change of national leadership, the ARM took a calculated risk and ploughed ahead, only to fail at the last hurdle in 1999. What these events remind us is that there is nothing inevitable about the Australian Republic. Yes, it is true, the history would appear to be on our side. The move to nationhood, one of our own as Governor-General, an end to appeals to the Privy Council and the Australia Act, all indicate a continuing move to true and meaningful independence. It's a powerful argument for change, but when it comes to a Republican constitution, it's that much harder. Two reasons. First of all, we're dealing with a referendum. The politics of a referendum in Australian history are clearly different from the politics of normal legislation. Secondly, this is a last stand for the monarchists. They've lost a lot along the way, but this is one they don't want to lose. And as we saw, they fight very hard, and even harder if necessary, to defend their beliefs. They aren't just living in the past, as we Republicans like to say. They're powerful advocates and relentless campaigners for their cause. And all they have to do is to get a majority overall or a majority in a majority of states to win their case. Short of that, all they need to do... Sorry, can I go back and read that again? All they have to do is is a majority overall or a majority in a majority of states to vote no in a referendum to be successful. Short of that, all they need to do is to convince politicians to steer clear of the issue. Either in the short run, out of respect, the least we should do it is wait for the Queen to abdicate or die. I'm sure you've heard that phrase once or twice. Or in the medium and long terms, there are many more important issues for Australians than changing a system that works with a minimum of fuss. To my mind, the significant hindrance to the Republican cause is this belief that it will be inevitable. It leads to complacency about the efforts that will be required to achieve the Republic. It leads Republicans to think that it won't be a matter of politics and that the people will see reason in the face of opinion. It also leads Republicans to think that whatever model is put forward and however it is developed, that it will be acceptable to the general public whose decision it will ultimately be. Rather, the truth is that the voters will need to be convinced that both the process and the model meet the tough standards they set when considering major changes of this sort. Indeed, we need to remind ourselves that there are good republics, not so good republics, and bad republics. This all being said, at the heart of the Republican vision is a very powerful idea. Australia in control of all of its institutions and with one of its own citizens as head of state. The idea that we should stop now, that the Queen is Queen of Australia, leaves an empty taste in the mouths of many Australians like me. What's the point of being in charge if we so radically reduce our options for the future? Isn't it demeaning to think that when the Queen moves on, the current system doesn't give us a role in choosing her replacement? Do we really believe that we couldn't design a better system for our nation? I believe this is a culture war. Republicans can win, but it needs a strategy to back it up, and one that will involve the people at every step of the way. It's now become clear, for example, that the monarchists have added the insights of celebrity politics to their armoury. They have marketed and personalised the royal family in a very clever and a very contemporary way. We have the Queen, solid and dependable, Prince Charles, eccentric but interesting, and Prince William and Kate and baby George. In other words, the matriarch, the slightly wayward son, and the dashing grandson. A dream world designed by some spin doctors in Buckingham Palace. Why wouldn't we wish to be part of all of this? It's fun and something we can share with all others that have the Queen as their head of state. So it shall be, I suspect, Australian Republic or not, just as it is with Hollywood and all of our film stars. And indeed, for much of our own politics today, celebrity plays a role. However, there are risks in this for the royal family, as we saw in the Charles and Diana debacle, and we also know that when the monarchists here push their luck too far, there's a pushback from the general public. We've seen this with the negative response to Tony Abbott's move to restore knights and dames to our system of honours, and also to his decision to swear allegiance to Her Majesty and not just to the Australian people. I think it's fair to say that Australians want their monarchists to be pragmatic and nationalist, like John Howard, in fact. However, we need also to note that the significant support Quentin Bryce received when she said, quote, "Perhaps one day, one young Australian girl or boy may even grow up to be our nation's first head of state." With these remarks, she touched upon some of the deepest instincts we have about independence, equality and opportunity. She was thinking aloud and in a Republican way. Why shouldn't an Australian citizen be our head of state? Why shouldn't any of us, whatever our religion or background, be entitled to be considered for such a position? This takes us to the Republicans, particularly those in the political class. Time and time again they have sent a clear message. It's the people who own the Constitution and whose views need to prevail if change is to be successful. These voters don't like it when the issue is treated as a political football, and they don't like it when their wishes are not taken seriously and ignored. They are suspicious of any fix agreed at the top, and of any parliamentary committee or constitutional convention set up as the last one was and looked like a mini parliament with all of the factions and posturing that we see in our current parliaments. They want Republicans all, be they radicals, moderates or minimalists, to take a breath and realise it is the people and not they who need to be convinced on what is best. Those wanting to make it happen will need to ensure the people are in charge every step of the way. As I've argued in my Manning Clark lecture earlier this year, we need a Republican means for a Republican end. And what does this mean? When the time arrives for developing a model for our future, deliberative democracy will be required. Random selection to achieve representativeness and proper facilitation to ensure deliberation. Recent examples from here and overseas, including, might I say, in the years of the Gallop government, particularly in the portfolio of the member for Perth, now member for Perth, Alana McTiernan, but also in other parts of our nation and also internationally, the effectiveness of this approach, I think, is clearly demonstrated. In Australia in 2009, we had a citizens' parliament of 150 citizens, one from each electorate, selected at random from the electoral roll. They met in Canberra to consider improvements to our political system. By all accounts, this event, which was supported by the not-for-profit New Democracy Foundation, produced very high-quality deliberation, a shifting of views as it progressed, and specific recommendations at the end. I wasn't surprised that this went well, because our own dialogue with the city here in Perth, where 1,100 participants, including 1/3 that were randomly selected, deliberated on the future of metropolitan Perth. But go to Ireland today. Go to the Republic of Ireland. I don't know whether you're aware, they've just finished a very effective process of consideration of elements of their constitution. 66 Irish men and women were randomly selected and 33 others chosen from across the political parties. And they met to recommend on a range of specified matters. In this case, the government wasn't obliged to implement their recommendations, just ensure they are debated properly in the legislature. We'd actually agreed in Western Australia that whatever came out of dialogue for the city, we would do. Some of my cabinet colleagues were not happy with me on that particular question. But somewhere along the line you have to trust people if you believe in democracy. In this case, the government isn't obliged to implement, just ensure they're debated. Amazing to see the things they recommended. Now remember, the Irish Constitution, De Valera, lots of religious politics in it. Randomly sected Irish people plus some parliamentary representatives have decided to replace the offence of blasphemy with a new general provision to include incitement to religious hatred, to include an explicit provision for gender equality, and to allow for same-sex marriage. In British Columbia, in 2005, a citizen assembly selected by lot met over 12 months to examine the province's electoral system. Their recommendation for change to a single transferable vote was supported by 57.7% in a referendum, but unfortunately fell short of the 60% required in their constitution. But I think that's pretty good evidence that the public backed what they came up with. I'm confident that a democratic deliberation along these lines and focused on the selection and powers of an Australian head of state is capable of doing two things. Firstly, breaking the back of community resistance to top-down initiatives defined and controlled by the political class. And secondly, producing an effective working model for an Australian republic. The fact remains, however, that putting the republic on the agenda and initiating a process like this is seen as a bridge too far by most of, if not all, of our contemporary political leaders. Some are opposed on principle, some worry about opening up the debate, and many just don't care. It's become a symbol for much that is Australian politics today. Limited and limiting, distrustful and destructive, adversarial and alienating. This takes us into the don't care province, about which much has been said in recent times. However, I put to you that not caring and not wanting to care are two different things. I think Australians do want to care about these issues and will care about them if they're given the chance to consider them. The Australian people want more engagement, not less, and it is leadership to this end, what we might quite properly call Republican leadership, that is needed for the cause of the Australian Republic to advance. Indeed, it's old and elitist thinking about politics that many monarchists rely upon, but which Republicans must avoid if the Republic is to be a possibility. Otherwise, it's going to be very complicated and very messy, and voters in a referendum do not like the products of a complicated and messy process of high-level political negotiation between the major parties and the minor parties, with all of the posturing that goes on. However, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude on another note. Isn't it strange that we spend so much of our time debating the question of what is an appropriate national day? Is it Australia Day? Is it Federation Day? Is it Anzac Day? When such a day actually awaits us and is ours to make. That will be the day that the nation exercises the freedom it possesses to create another freedom. The freedom to choose who amongst us shall be our head of state and what powers and responsibilities they should have. It will liberate us in ways unknown. Going it alone is like that, but such that after it's all done and dusted, we will ask, why didn't we do it earlier? Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's my privilege to have the opportunity to ask you to vote of thanks for our speaker. I find it quite extraordinary in a way that he chose a topic which, in his own words, is not very highly ranked on the political agenda at the present time. And if I might say, it's almost vanished for many of us. And yet the talk that we've just heard from a man who essentially is a political scientist, I would have thought, I can't think of any other word than the word passionate. A genuine, powerful, underlying belief that this is the one remaining step that somehow Australia has fallen short. I was delighted to hear so much emphasis on what we have already done, and in particular on the Australia Acts, I think the significance of which is probably understated. That we have emancipated our constitution completely, except for the issue that we've been hearing discussed today. The process by which the change can come about, unfortunately, is a very difficult process. Geoff mentioned constitutional referenda. I had the opportunity recently to go to the United States and talking about John Curtin's government and so on, and I, in the course of that, noticed that in 1946, the Australian people overwhelmingly supported a series of proposals put up by a Labor government, which is almost a recipe for certain defeat on most occasions. And why was this? Because the Curtin government had made substantial changes to the Commonwealth powers system, and mentioned things like unemployment and health benefits and all the rest, and it was carried overwhelmingly. If you can get the right issue at the right moment, the seemingly impossible can be achieved. And I think, therefore, that what we've heard today is a marvellous reminder that we've achieved an awful lot, a heck of a lot, and we've achieved so much that it makes this final step, the fact we're not taking it, all that more difficult to understand. I'm particularly interested to the reference to celebrity politics. There's not the slightest doubt that the royal family has been given a new lease of life in the Australian context. The various generations where their moves are followed exactly the same as if they were absolute celebrities in pop music or anything else of that kind. That, of course, can be a two-edged sword, as Geoff pointed out. I was also fascinated at his concluding reference to the process of what we call deliberative assemblies, a thing which I was very suspicious of and thought little of until I met a passionate devotee of them, and came to realise that if you get people together and inform them properly, they can come up with really worthwhile solutions. But unfortunately, it needs the trust that those who are in the position then to implement those decisions will do so. I could go on at great length, but I don't intend to. I'd like to say that I'm absolutely impressed that Geoff can take an issue that, in a sense, is not on the agenda and make of it a really worthwhile, fascinating and highly memorable address. And I'd like you to show our appreciation in the usual way.